Buffalo Bills starting in the AFC East. Bills from PFF get a B-.
Now, I see we have the most generous grades in the entire list, which, look, we said this before.
Oh, yeah, we do, huh?
We give out slightly generous grades on the basis that we work for all 32 teams. Now, that being said, I feel like being more generous than the NFL.com is a step too far.
Might be too much.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there was some science to it, too, I think, from Trevor that we talked about on the show yesterday, where he said it was in relation to the big board. I'm going to sneeze, I think.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm good. Went away.
Great.
We're good. It was judging picks in relation to the big board. Where's Thor? He's always harsh on. He's always very strong. He's not even on the.
I don't see Thor.
Oh, he's not on the list yet. He's not on the list yet. I need to. Thor, send your grades over. They're always aggressive. You know there'll be some Fs in there. You know the Vikings are getting an A+ because he loves J.J. McCarthy. We know that's happening.
It's true. Yeah.
Buffalo Bills, number 22 in the aggregate, B- per PFF. A couple teams. Doug Farrar had an A-. That was the highest grade for the Buffalo Bills. Look, the biggest story here is they're sitting there late first round. They trade out to the Kansas City Chiefs. And again, I think this, when we talk about stories that we go back to and rehash years from now, the Bills were sitting there with wide receiver 5 on the board. They could have had the 5th receiver off the board, anybody that they want, knowing that it's a deep wide receiver class, knowing that it was a huge need for the Bills after trading Stephon Diggs. And they traded down with the Kansas City Chiefs. A couple other receivers went off the board before they picked again. And then top of day 2, they take Keon Coleman out of Florida State. That's the biggest story. I'll run through some of the other names. Cole Bishop, the safety from Utah. You saw him on the screen while I was rambling. Dwayne Carter, the defensive tackle from Duke. Ray Davis, the running back from Kentucky. And a bunch of others. Your thoughts for the Bills?
Yeah, I mean, their big story is obviously that whole wide receiver dynamic. Sitting there 28 overall, having traded away Stephon Diggs in what was clearly not a pre-planned move, with the contract extension that he'd signed, with the trade they got for him. This was not when that was supposed to happen, if indeed it was ever supposed to happen. Neither was the trade so tempting that they couldn't turn it down, right? They had just obviously reached their end with Stephon Diggs, but consequently they needed to replace him. They have some players on the roster, but none of them are a high impact, top end wide receiver. It's guys like Curtis Samuel or Khalil Shakir, who became a much bigger part of that offense late last year, but you wouldn't want as your number one wide receiver necessarily. So everyone assumed Buffalo's just taken the best wide receiver available at 28 overall, or was going to go aggressively trade upwards and go get wide receiver 4, maybe even wide receiver 3 at the bottom of the top 10. Didn't end up happening. They're there at 28. They do have that chance to take wide receiver 5, whoever they thought that was, and they trade back with Kansas City, let the Chiefs select Xavier Worthy, and then they trade back again out of the first round. In each occasion, the team coming up took a wide receiver. So they went from wide receiver 5 to wide receiver 8. Now, for Buffalo, it might have been the same player. If Keon Coleman was their guy the whole way, they were able to trade down twice, which only, I think, netted them pick swaps, like moving up in rankings as opposed to getting additional picks themselves. But theoretically, they got additional draft capital and were able to select their guy anyway, if that was how it worked. But to me, so that's one element that's really interesting. They took that risk that they were willing to trade back a couple of times and still get their guy, and do it at least on one occasion to their biggest rival in Kansas City. There's that phrase, right? In order for it to be a rivalry, both teams have to win, as opposed to.
The Bills have won a lot, just the regular season games.
Yeah, but not the important ones in the postseason when they lose.
It's a rivalry.
I don't know. Anyway, the point being, they let Kansas City go and take the guy they wanted, which is interesting in itself. And then Keon Coleman being the guy that they identified as like the answer. And the reason I say that is they drafted one wide receiver, they had 10 or 11 draft picks, and did not come back and get another one. And even in the undrafted free agent pool, you see that every year. Teams sometimes will take a guy, and then they'll come back and they'll grab 4 or 5 free agents after the draft at that position. The Bills didn't even really do that. They added a couple of wide receivers as undrafted free agents in a giant undrafted free agent pool. So Keon Coleman is basically it. They've said he's our answer, and we've talked about him a lot in the pre-draft process. I like him as a receiver. I think there is absolutely a pathway to him being a very good NFL player. but he's not the cleanest of prospects in terms of there's no concerns, there's no red flags, there's no areas of worry. He's a risky prospect, and the Bills have identified him as the guy to come in and be, at the very minimum, a very big part of that offense, next to Khalil Shakir and the tight ends and that kind of thing. Just a sort of fascinating individual evaluation by them.
I think it's interesting when you look at the Bills, the evolution of their receiving core. Remember when before Stephon Diggs got there, it was John Brown and Cole Beasley were the first two guys who really started to get Josh Allen going and getting on track. So they had a distinct slot in Cole Beasley, distinct deep threat in John Brown. Then Stephon Diggs gets there, and it felt like, wow, that's a perfect number one wide receiver to pull everything together. Since that point now you lose, and at points they had Gabe Davis, who was more your deep threat, and they still had Diggs. So now Diggs is gone. You lose the true number one. And I mentioned this on the live show. A couple of years ago, Brandon Beane said, yeah, we're trying to get a little bit better creating plays after the catch. And that was the draft 2 years ago when they bring in James Cook, the running back, and Khalil Shakir, the wide receiver. And it's like, all right, that's something that they don't necessarily have. Now it feels like, Keon Coleman is a big receiver, but he's very good after the catch, has those punt return skills. You still have Khalil Shakir. They bring in Curtis Samuel, and that's his game, right, is all the short stuff and gimmicky type things and create after the catch. Dalton Kincaid, underneath, short area, tight end, and you still have Cook, who's the featured back here. So it does seem like the Bills are trying to create plays after the catch, short area, short passing game. That's not to say, clearly, I think they're expecting more from Keon Coleman. He's not just a yak guy. They've seen the contested catches, the one-handed catches, the downfield wins that Keon Coleman has had, and saying, okay, he could be an all-around guy. I believe they believe that he can do more, but it's interesting to me that is a part of the top 5 playmakers on Buffalo is yak-driven.
The fit here is fascinating to me. You need to hear more about what they plan on doing with Keon Coleman, because I would urge anybody to go and listen to Matt Harmon's video on YouTube about Keon Coleman. He's essentially the key characteristic of Coleman is you've got all the contested catch stuff, you've got some good after the catch skills, but he does not separate against man coverage in particular. He's actually quite good in zones and understands how to separate against zone coverage, but in separation percentage against single coverage, he's in the 0th percentile in your PFF IQ, right? That's bad. That's not good at all, right? And
0th.
Yeah, the 0th. So does not essentially separate at any point against man coverage. Now, the key characteristic of a classic X wide receiver is those guys need to beat man coverage. That's what they do. That's the guy that can get pressed at the line of scrimmage, and he needs to be able to beat man coverage consistently. So that's where their hole is, right? That was what Stephon Diggs did for them, even if he's not necessarily a classic X receiver in terms of size and all those kinds of things. That was his role in that offense. So now you've got Khalil Shakir, who's not a classic X wide receiver. Curtis Samuel, definitely not. And any of the guys on the depth chart lower down, KJ Hamler, Matt Collins-ish. But that's the hole, right? So if Keon Coleman is being brought in to be that, there's immediate red flags that is not what he does well. And Matt Harmon sort of said the guys that have succeeded with that production profile, this is Matt Harmon of Reception, Perception fame and Yahoo Sports, etc. So he said the guys that have succeeded with that profile are one of two types of players. It's either guys that became big slot weapons, right, moved inside, and that's what they did, or weirdly boom or bust deep threats, guys like DJ Chark and Will Fuller. There were a few other names like that. Now, Coleman's definitely not that, right? He just doesn't have the gas to be the consistent deep threat. So logically, he becomes the big slot. But you already have Curtis Samuel and other guys, and Dalton Kincaid, who was literally the big slot for them last year. So that spot is actually kind of taken up. So it doesn't look like a natural fit unless you hear from them like how they plan on making those jigsaw pieces fit together. And that's why, again, it feels a little worrying that was their one swing at the bat when it comes to wide receiver.
So the other part of the draft with the Bills, as you mentioned, they kept trading down. They would pick swap, jump up 30 picks here, 40 picks there. I thought it was an important draft for the Bills, given all the turnover this offseason. So they added a lot of volume. I always like that. Cole Bishop, their second-round pick, the safety out of Utah, really intriguing prospect. He's very athletic. I think he's a guy that Right now, I don't think he's got the skills to be an all-around safety. I don't necessarily trust him in deep coverage, but when I was watching him, reminded me a little bit of Kenny Vaccaro, who spent a lot of time in the NFL. I think when Vaccaro came out as a first-round pick, very athletic, out of Texas, covered the slot, and people expected him to be like the guy that slows down slot receivers and is a hammer in the run game. I think Vaccaro, for the most of his career, just became like a true box safety who could match up with tight ends here and there. I see that with Bishop. Coverage as a free safety was poor using PFF grades, but Bishop, 99th percentile athleticism using PFF gas, tested well. I think he can cover tight ends extremely well. He's just, to me, he's your pure box safety. And so they already have Mike Edwards. They already have Taylor Rapp on the roster. I wonder if Bishop has a specific role carved out for him, taking away tight ends. Again, I know Travis Kelce might only have a year or two left with the Chiefs, but very specifically in that matchup or against a Ravens team with the Mark Andrews. That matchup, I think, will be intriguing once we get to the NFL season for rookie Cole Bishop. Any other of the picks for the Bills that you wanted to highlight? Ray Davis, of course.
Yeah, I think they had a lot of really interesting names actually added. Dwayne Carter, I think, has a lot of talent, incredible bull rush strength. I think he's very close to sort of, if you can string together some moves and not just try and run through everybody every single play, but like actually disengage from the bull rush once you've got some vertical movement, I think he can be a disruptive player. Cedric Van Pran, the center from Georgia, anyone that listened to our Ramon Foster offensive line show before the draft, he really likes that guy. Thinks was he first or second on his list of centers? Like very high.
Had him third, right behind JPJ and Zach Frazier,
Okay.
I believe.
But that guy has a pathway to starting for this team as a 5th-round draft pick. Javon Solomon from Troy, I think, is a really intriguing pick as well, a guy that has some juice as a pass rusher. And then their last pick, Travis Clayton from the International Player Pathway.
Oh,
this is fascinating
expertise.
because, so he was a rugby player, but not a good one. He was apparently in the 8th tier of rugby in England, which is basically, you could play in the 8th tier of rugby, like today. You know what I mean? Like, that's not high. So I don't know how you identify. Number one, I don't know how a guy that's that athletic and that freaky as an athlete survived in the 8th tier of rugby without somebody putting him higher just on athleticism alone, even if he couldn't catch a ball. But he was plucked from that kind of level, has a boxing background as well, and it's just such a freaky athlete that, again, he got drafted in the 7th round with 0 football experience. So that, it's a Mailata story, except at a much lower level of rugby.
See, you can't get this from every other podcast. That's why we are a top 5 podcast featuring an Irishman who lives here in America.
That's right.
Top 5 NFL podcast with those terms. Other shout out to Javon Solomon from Troy, edge rusher with some pass rush juice. I think solid players. Again, when you go back, it's like I would have chosen a few different players, but I see intriguing time for the Bills where a lot of these guys can contribute right away.
Solomon is a really interesting body type where he looks like James Harrison, but if you stretched James Harrison's arms, like he has 34-inch arms at 6'1".
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. Like
He's about 260.
He's a big, he looks like James Harrison, except his arms are like way longer. I'm like, immediately, first thing I saw of him was like, oh, that's a sort of James Harrison, Contavious Street type body. And then I was like, wait, how long are that dude's arms? They're just like hanging down there at this unnatural length. So he's got this sort of, I kind of wonder if he's got all the advantages of, the James Harrison, Elvis Dumerville, short, low down to the ground leverage plays, but with the arm length to not get just bodied by bigger offensive tackles that can get into him.
Yeah, Solomon's a nice pick in the 5th round. I think he has a chance to jump right into that defensive line rotation.
Yeah.
Create some pass rush off the edge.